Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm your host, Anthony Moreno. Today on the program, we discuss a genetic disease that affects many in New Mexico. Cerebral Cavernous Angioma is an abnormal blood vessel in the brain that may lead to stroke symptoms in children and adults. This disease is found in high rates in Hispanic families, many in New Mexico, and is also known as Common Hispanic Mutation. There is a campaign working to educate and connect family members who may be affected by CHM. Please welcome our guests for the program. From the Baca Family Historical Project, Nora Chavez, who works in community engagement for the project, and Joyce Gonzales, a genealogist and Baca family member with the project. Thank you both for taking the time to join us.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you so much.
Nora, I want to start with you. Could you share with us a little bit about the organization and the mission of the organization?
Great. Well, thank you again. My name is Nora Chavez, and I am the Community Engagement Specialist for the Baca Family Historical Project. And we are a 4-year granted project that's been funded through Angioma Alliance, which is a national nonprofit organization. And the program here was to do outreach to throughout the state, but predominantly in rural and frontier areas of New Mexico, to try to identify family descendants of the original settler, Cristobal Baca, who came here in the 1600s. And we've been doing that very successfully, I have to say. And we have identified many, many families who are carriers of the genetic mutation, and also work with them to create a support system so that they have someone to turn to who also has the illness, so that they can get to understand the complications, learn how to work with their doctors, and even to get it identified, which is usually a very, very long experience, but to try to identify. Of course, now with DNA tests, it's a lot quicker. But again, it's very easy to have symptoms and go on for years and not even know that you carry this genetic mutation.
Now, Nora, could you give us a little bit of history of this genetic mutation and how it's tied to the history here in New Mexico with the Camino Real?
Great. Well, when what is now New Mexico started to be settled, it was El Frontero Nuevo Mexico, and the settlers came from Mexico City, and they traveled up directly to what is now El Paso and Las Cruces, which was El Paso del Norte, and they followed the Camino Real. I don't know if a lot of people know, I would hope they do from their 6th grade history of New Mexico. The Camino Real, which runs all the way from El Paso into Las Cruces north into what is now Owingeh. And right now, in modern times, we have I-25, which pretty much parallels El Camino Real all the way up north. And so as the settlers came and settled along, and Joyce will tell you about the Baca family, we believe that it was one of the Baca families who had the genetic mutation. They came, they settled, they had families, and so the mutation spread along the settlement areas, which was the Camino Real. And of course, some of them expanded east and west and north all the way up into Colorado. But it's a fascinating history because the Camino Real is still there. You can actually go and walk sections of it if you want to. And you'll see signs, of course, as you're driving through Albuquerque or any of the other small cities around there, you'll see a sign that says El Camino Real. And so to think that this genetic mutation, which began, we believe, here in New Mexico, has spread all across the state, and it all has to do with the immigration and the settlement of the families.
Joyce, you are a Baca family member, a descendant from some of the early settlers here. Could you share with us how you first became aware of this mutation?
Sure. First of all, I did not know I was a member of the Baca family, but when I started doing my genealogy, probably about 25 years ago, just my own family, personal genealogy, It didn't take too long before I found that I and probably most people in New Mexico come from the Baca family in one way or the other. And so I found my connection. But as far as myself having the illness, my mother, who I inherited it from, had already passed. So I didn't know that. But I started having symptoms that no doctor was able to really figure out what it was. But through persistence and sending my medical records at the time, we're talking 15 years ago, things have changed since then, but to Colorado and then to Arizona, I was able to be identified that I also carried this mutation, and that's where my symptoms were coming from.
Joyce, would you mind sharing with us, if it's all right, some of those symptoms?
Sure, absolutely. I'll start off by saying mine were not the most common symptoms that you see. The most common symptoms are going to be seizures of some type, usually more of a focal seizure, or maybe that you've been told there are a lot of aneurysms in your family, but aneurysms are not hereditary. Or if you have a stroke, but the key there is if you have a stroke before the age of 60, that says maybe that's what you're having. But my symptoms were neurological. I was about 30 years old. I put my arms down on the table for the first time I noticed symptoms, and between my pinkies and my elbows, I felt as if I had pins and needles being shoved into my arms, or maybe as if my arms were burnt at that point. And again, like I told you, after many, many, many doctor's appointments and many years, to tell you the truth, I was finally diagnosed by a neurosurgeon in Colorado. That what I was having is I was having a bleed in my spinal cord. Oh, wow. That was causing these neurological damages. And by that point, they knew I needed to go in ASAP for surgery. I had that done in Phoenix, Arizona by a well-known neurosurgeon, Dr. Robert Spetzler. And because was a little bit of a complicated surgery, but anyway, this was about 15 years ago. And since then, I really am doing very well. So thank God that I figured this out, because as my neurosurgeon told me, if I in my case did not have it done, and if I had a significant bleed, I would have been left paralyzed from the neck down.
Oh my goodness. Well, we're certainly glad to hear that you're able to get that taken care of and address that issue. A lot of folks may not even know that they are living with this genetic mutation. Do you have any idea of what we're looking at as far as statistics on how many folks may be living with this?
The reason that has been such a difficult number to come up with is because most people were being misdiagnosed or undiagnosed. So they were maybe being recorded as if they had a stroke, or as if they had something else, maybe, I don't know. It was hard, but working with it statistically and looking at, because we've been able to go back to 400 years back and figure out a couple of families that one of them, who was our grandparent, was the first grandparent whose gene mutated, that this illness began. And given that, we start from that couple and we have moved our way down because we know how many original children they had. We also know that if a person is affected, 50% of each of their children will have a 50% chance of inheriting this illness. So when we do it statistically, we think there's probably about 30,000 people in New Mexico today that have the illness. And until it is really recorded correctly and we start getting the correct statistics, we may not know that still for a while, but that's what genealogy has helped us to come up with.
I see. Nora, now how has it been with being able to contact possible generations of people who may be descendants of the Baca family and the other families that may be connected to this? Has it been a little bit easier now that you have technology, social media, and digital capabilities?
Absolutely, and we've certainly learned a lot from that. When we first started, we were doing presentations, community level presentations at libraries, etc. And we had our first big conference in 2017, and we were shocked I mean, the conference sold out, even though it was free, but the ticket availability was gone in about an hour.
Wow.
And we had a packed house to the point that we had to schedule another conference a couple of months later, again, full house. So this is what we've been doing. We have literally been going up and down the state from Las Cruces. We've had two conferences in Las Cruces, one in El Paso. We have family group connections in Las Cruces, and all the way up into Taos, Chama, of course, Española, etc. And we try to take this where we feel there are hotspots of people, families who have a higher incidence of carrying the genetic mutation. So certainly has helped us out a lot. One of the big challenges that we had, of course, this year with COVID was that we couldn't do our in-person presentations and conferences, etc. And many of our families in the rural areas don't even have access to internet, much less be able to handle a Zoom presentation. So finally, it came to me. I said, let's do this on radio. Everybody has radio. And so we had a few connections. We had our first radio conference on KDCE, which is a Mexican station radio in Española. It was so successful. We had so many people call and contact us, etc. That was followed by, KSFR. We did another one, and now we have you as well reaching out here in the South. So it's amazing how many people, instead of just reaching out to a couple of hundred people for the conference, we are reaching out to thousands now with being on TV and radio. But of course, we also have our Baca Family webpage, which is bacafamily.org, and we have 2 or 3, I should say, Facebook pages where we communicate a lot of current information to people. And we have contacts coming in from not just New Mexico, but across the country and even overseas as well. And this is the same thing with the families here in New Mexico contacting their relatives elsewhere out of state saying, you need to listen to this radio broadcast, or you need to contact them and see if maybe the medical issues you're having are tied to this.
Joyce, you addressed DNA testing a little bit. I'd like to hear more from you about that. There's a lot of sites that are very popular right now where people are becoming more interested in understanding their family history and going to get DNA testing. Many folks are learning how this could be helpful as well to prevent situations like yours. Could you share with us a little bit about how doing that may help folks understand how they're connected to this genetic mutation?
Yes, I will. First of all, let me mention, as far as we're talking about family names and so forth, my name is Gonzales through marriage. My maiden name was Romero, and my mother's maiden name was Campos. And since then, we have learned my mother was the carrier of this illness. And I would say to date, 20 of my Campos family have been diagnosed with CCM. And as far as DNA, because that is the best way to be tested, to be your starting place, even before MRIs and so on and so forth. We have had a grant, and that's how part of the way that Nora and I have been reaching out to people. And through that grant, we were able to offer free DNA testing for a good while there for people who might be at higher risk. Since then, that is not available. And due to COVID, they have decided not to be sending, saliva and so forth back and forth. But we have learned something pretty exciting as of recently. There is one company doing DNA testing right now, which is Ancestry.com, that actually is somehow obtaining the information that allows us to find out if a person is positive for this illness or not. And I'm always suggesting to people that I talk to, do it when they're on sale. They're on sale all the time. They're on sale right now for the holidays. Do the cheapest testing they have. We don't need you to do anything really expensive, just the least expensive test they offer. Then, now it doesn't end there. It's not quite that simple. They're not going to tell you if you have it, if you don't. But working with us, we have a software program that we've developed that we can then put the raw DNA in, and then we can tell a person if they are affected or not. And we always test the oldest living person in a family because this illness does not skip generations. So let's say your father is still alive and you're concerned that maybe you might have inherited it from him if you're having symptoms. We would test him first, because if he's positive, now we need to go on and test you. If he's negative, then you couldn't have it, because again, it does not skip generations.
Now, this goes so far back into New Mexico's history.
Yes.
I'd like to hear just how the process was in finding out that it dates back to Cristobal Baca and Ana Ortiz. Could you share with us just a little bit about the research and how you're able to find that out?
Absolutely. First of all, I was working with Dr. Leslie Morrison. She's was one of the lead researchers at UNMH. And basically what we did is I began working with people that I was meeting individually or contacting me that we knew had been medically diagnosed today with CCM. Dr. Morrison shared with me that the research had figured out two things. It had figured out that it was a autosomal dominant mutation. Again, that means it does not skip generations. She also said when they look at the mutation, it was in all of us that have it today, it is always identical. And what that tells them is the only way it's possible for it to always be identical is if we all descend from the same grandparent that had this illness initially. So beginning with about 20 people who we knew had the illness today, I went back in time, and believe me, it was easier said than done. It took about 15 years of research, but we went back in time to find at least several sets of grandparents that we all descend from. And then that allowed me, as I went up the ladder, so to speak, to identify people, because it went from parent to child, that had this illness throughout time. People ask me all the time, how do you know my great-grandfather had it? Because it's the line that takes them back to our very same set of grandparents. Now, as we've talked a lot about the Baca family, I do want to clarify that we know that it didn't start with Cristobal Baca and Ana Ortiz. Possibly it started with one of their grandchildren, who was also named, their great-grandchild, who was named Manuel Baca. And then we have to date now identified a Baca family back in history. So it doesn't mean because you're Baca that you have this illness. We have a specific Baca family. We now know that about 5 brothers were carriers. So that means that their father had the illness. We also could never figure out how the people in Mexico who had our exact same mutation were coming back to us. And we have since discovered that they all descend from, as we all descend from, from Juan Dominguez and Elena de la Cruz Mendoza, who one of them came from Spain. And I would like to talk a little bit about Spain, because people ask that question all the time.
Yeah.
And we figured that one of them, and now they all tie back to the people in northern Mexico that have the exact same mutation that we do. I descend from both that group, from Juan Dominguez and Elena de la Cruz Mendoza, and Antonio Baca and his wife, Monica Durani Chavez. So bottom line is I could have inherited from the Dominguez Mendoza or from the Baca line. What we do know is this: people in New Mexico that have the illness in one way or another will go back to the Baca family, starting with Manuel Baca. And so we do know that much. But as far as Spain, if I may have a moment with that, people ask me all the time, did this illness start in Spain? And even though we know Juan Dominguez came to Mexico from Spain, and he may have been the initial carrier, he was a child, and he did not get married or have his children until he got to Mexico. Then him and his family moved to New Mexico. And after the Pueblo Revolt, they went back to northern Mexico. And most of their family stayed there from that time forward. So even though both of their grandparents were born in Spain, the mutation didn't happen until they reached Mexico and then New Mexico.
Wow, thank you for sharing, that in-depth information about just how far this could go back. Nora, could you give us an idea about the outreach efforts? You mentioned here in New Mexico, but on your website, there's also some information that says this could go well beyond New Mexico. You mentioned on your site that it's also in parts of southern Colorado.
Yes, actually, because families moved and there were different migration periods, especially here in New Mexico. Once they were settled during the Depression, a lot of families moved west to California. In fact, there is Bacaville, I guess, there, which was settled by the Baca family. It all traces back to New Mexico. In Southern California, we had a lot of families that migrated and went up north into Southern Colorado, and that's a huge spot as well, just as there is in Mexico that Joyce explained. But they also moved into Texas, so we have families in Houston and Dallas, et cetera, that have this. And one of the things that we worked very closely with Henrietta Christmas, who's the president of the New Mexico Genealogical Society, and through their efforts, and they were amazing in helping, working with Joyce and doing a lot of the research as well. They estimate that Cristobal Baca has about 3 million descendants in the Southwest. So if you imagine that many grandkids and great-great-great-great-grandkids and so on and so forth, you see how one simple genetic mutation can keep on being transferred down for 400 years. We do have certain hotspots that I want to mention here in New Mexico that we like to highlight and let people know, so that if they hear this or come across this, they should just give us a contact. Of course, if your last name specifically is Cristobal, Cabeza de Baca, that's a very high risk last name. And there are others that Joyce can talk to you about. But the hotspots in towns are Las Cruces, Socorro, Belen, Los Lunas, Albuquerque, moving on up into Española, going west to Las Vegas and Santa Rosa, then back up north into Santa Fe, Taos, going all the way up into Taos, and then also going a little bit west up into Chama. So as you can see, all of this followed the Camino Real, the way families immigrated and traveled and settled. And now with modern times, we do find several cases of people who carried the same genetic mutation in foreign countries. And when we talk to them and get to know them, we always find out that it comes right back. Their parents or their grandparents or whatever were from New Mexico. So we feel very much assured that it all started here.
Yeah, and you mentioned some, I'm sorry, Joyce, I'll let you jump in, that Nora had mentioned some names that folks may want to be aware of. Can you go ahead and let us know what some of those names may be and that they may be at high risk potentially?
Sure. And I was just going to add to what Nora said, that actually a place that people probably wouldn't even realize or think about, because it's just such a small community, that we know is a real hot spot in New Mexico, is the Peña Blanca area between Santa Fe and Albuquerque. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say people that live there right now, but I would say descendants, grandparents that came out of that area. And as Nora mentioned, she mentioned that people coming from the Cabeza de Baca, but today we don't know those people as Cabeza de Baca, because we do know, and the reason Peña Blanca is such a hot spot is because a gentleman by the name of Luis Maria Cabeza de Baca, he changed his name, it was Baca, he changed it to Cabeza de Baca, believing that he might have been a descendant of a famous explorer with that last name. One of his land grants was Peña Blanca. Now, he went on to have 23 children. We know he had the illness. We know that. He had 23 children with 3 wives. So we know he is probably going to have been a large influence. And his land grant was Peña Blanca. And then the name after about the first, he named himself Cabeza Baca, his 23 children Cabeza de Baca. And in about a generation or two, the name went down to Cide Baca. So if there was one family in New Mexico or wherever they may have moved to, up southern Colorado or wherever, that is going to be, I believe, at highest risk, it would be the Cide Baca name. But to give you some more names that we've learned about. So the first names I'm going to give you are the names in New Mexico. that, and again, I need to say this first, because you have this name does not mean you have the illness.
Okay, before you start, I want to let our audience, I want to let you know that we only have about 1.5 minutes left.
Okay.
So just to give you
I'll do it as quickly as I can. In New Mexico, these names are going to might be at high risk. Apodaca, Aragon, Armijo, Baca, City Baca, Campos, Casaus, Chavez, coming from the Dudani Chavez, Espinosa, Gallegos, Garcia, Gonzales, Lopez, Lucero, Luna, Mays, Martinez, Mora, Ortiz, Padilla, Quintana, Rivera, Romero, more from the Sandoval County, Silva, Sandoval, and Vigil. That's what in New Mexico. I have some other names more in northern Mexico, but I don't think we have the time for that.
Yeah, unfortunately we don't, but we have just over 30 seconds left. But Nora, I do want to give you an opportunity to let folks know how they can get in touch with your organization.
Wonderful. And a quick add that all of those names are available on our website, which is bacafamily.org. You can also give us a call at 505-450-5902. We're more than happy to answer questions. We will help you develop your family tree and work with you to see that you get tested and identified.
Nora Chavez, Joyce Gonzales from the Baca Family Historical Project. I want to thank you both for joining us on the program.
Thank you
so much.
And we want to thank you for joining us on Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Anthony Morneau. We'll see you next time. And don't forget, you can always find out more information about this program and others at krwg.org.